Hello everyone, I am Safir, faculty at Mentora IAS, and today I welcome you to the current affairs session focused upon the United Nations and its mandate with respect to the ongoing United Nations General Assembly session that we are seeing. Okay, so today we are going to talk about what exactly is the United Nations, what exactly has happened in this particular session, and subsequently we'll be looking deep into the various bodies of the United Nations. Okay, why exactly is this important? Because first of all, it is the 80th anniversary of United Nations. Second, we have seen a lot of reforms that have that voices have been clamoring, and India is one of those leading voices. Also, at the same time, there has been a significant amount of international recognition to a very important issue, that is basically recognition of Palestine as an independent and sovereign state. So we are going to discuss this entire thing on the backdrop of these events. तो आज ये जो यूनाइटेड नेशंस पे पूरा का पूरा डिस्कशन रहेगा, ये प्योरली मेंस के ऊपर ओरिएंटेड है. ठीक है. सो वी विल बेसिकली बी टॉकिंग अबाउट कि भाई किस तरीके से यूनाइटेड नेशंस जो है हिस्टोरिकली एमर्ज करता है, इवॉल्व कैसे होता है उसका रोल, एंड सब्सिक्वेंटली विल बी टॉकिंग अबाउट व्हाट एग्जैक्टली इज द करंट सिचुएशन देयर एंड व्हाट एग्जैक्टली इज डिमांड फ्रॉम इंडिया फॉर द रिफॉर्म एट द यूनाइटेड नेशन सिक्योरिटी काउंसिल एज वेल. ठीक है. तो लेट अस बिगिन दिस पर्टिकुलर सेशन. सबसे पहले हम बात करने वाले हैं कि what exactly has been in the news. So in the news it has been that we have just seen the conclusion of the 80th session of the General Assembly's open debate or the general debate. Okay, so the United Nations General Assembly every single year it comes together in the month of September, and subsequently it opens up a debate. Okay, so that debate is basically a platform where all the world leaders and the head of states, they basically come, make their statements, express their opinions, and subsequently on important matters like international peace, security, developmental related aspects, poverty, climate change, इन सारी चीज़ों पे बात करते करते they basically come up with resolutions. So that is basically the role of General Assembly open debate or the general debate. So the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly recently has concluded, and the theme for this particular year was Better Together, 80 years and more for peace, development and human rights. So over the year, what exactly has been the role of the United Nations is actually encapsulated in this very theme. So every single year, the United Nations General Assembly has a particular theme over which the debate is opened up. So this particular year's debate topic was basically Better Together, that everyone needs to come together as a cooperative union so that we can be talking about progress, development and at the same time propagation of human rights. Okay. So from the Indian side, we had the Union Minister for External Affairs, Dr. S. Jaishankar. He made the statement on behalf of India, and subsequently he made a really strong pitch, not just for the reforms in the United Nations Security Council, but also highlighted what basically have been the lacunae which have been there in the recent past. So we are going to read about that as well. But apart from that, there has been a very important step that has been taken during the ongoing session of the United Nations General Assembly, and that is that there have been certain members of the United Nations which have actually granted official recognition to Palestine. Okay, so this basically official recognition relates to the ongoing war between Israel and the Hamas at the Gaza Strip, where right now the situation is that there has been mounting international pressure on Israel to cease the military operations which is harming the civilians, and at the same time the pressure is also upon relieving the restrictions that Israel is actually imposing on the humanitarian aid that is being sent to the Gaza Strip. Okay, so the point being that recognition of Palestine by such powers, especially two of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, one is France, the other one is the United Kingdom, followed by other allies of the USA and which we call as the Western democracy like Canada. Okay, these are the countries which actually have granted formal recognition to the state of Palestine. So towards the end, we are also going to discuss what exactly this entails, and we will be discussing a brief you can say layout of what exactly has been the Israel-Palestine situation, but we are not going to take a detailed discussion on that. That we will be keeping it for the next time. Okay, so this has basically been in the news कि 80th session में ये सारी चीजें जो हैं वो हुई हैं. Now with respect to the speech of the External Affairs Minister from India, Dr. S. Jaishankar, the speech he made certain points pretty clear. The first thing, he criticized the United Nations for failing to act upon a lot of humanitarian crises that is being seen in the world. Okay, and some of these crises basically retard the objective of sustainable development goals. Some of them basically are creating a problem of refugees, and subsequently they are also slowing down the international or worldly peace. So that is basically what Dr. S. Jayashankar highlighted for the first thing in its speech. So he basically said that there are two different areas which have right now been the you can say theaters of war. One is West Asia, where we see Israel militarily acting not just upon the Gaza Strip but also taking out strikes in Lebanon in the past, and also in the most recent terms Qatar. Okay, so this is one part of the story. The second part of the story basically is going on in Europe, which is the confrontation between Russia and Ukraine, which basically is not ceasing. So both of these things have actually put not just India but the international community in a very you can say peculiar kind of fix. Why? First of all, no one is liking this. Okay, nobody is liking what exactly is going on. Why? Because now, because of the ongoing wars and prolonged wars, what has happened is that there have been disruptions in trade. There have also been a unilateral imposition of sanctions, and that is something which is hampering the markets of other countries. Okay, India being one of such you can say victims, and this is also something that the External Affairs Minister mentioned during his speech. Okay, that there has been a lot of volatility that has been introduced with respect to trade. Okay, and that has been due to the unilateral imposition of tariffs by certain countries, at the same time also strangle holding the supply chains of various critical minerals, and also controlling the access to technology to developing countries. And this is basically being done deliberately in order to punish them for something that is actually serving their interest. Okay, so basically this was an oblique reference to what the United States of America has accused India to be doing for its part. Basically, the United Nations of America as of now opines that the Republic of India basically is the country which is actually helping Russia fund the war. Why? Because India is continuously buying discounted rates of oil. Okay, we basically are buying our crude oil from Russia. Now this is something which has changed since 2022, that Russia has become our biggest supplier of oil, and that is because of the heavy and steep amount of discounts that it is offering to our oil marketing companies. Now with respect to India, we are an oil dependent economy. So because we are an oil dependent economy, it doesn't matter that what exactly is the scenario of the international you can say criticism, but the point is that with respect to food security in India, with respect to energy security in India, with respect to transportation of most of the country, we need fossil fuels. And these fossil fuels predominantly are two things. One which is crude oil, the second which is coal, but coal largely we use with respect to our own reserves. We only import coal for specific purposes like coking. Okay, which is usually a process done for steel making. The second thing, crude oil is something which we do not have in sufficient quantities, we have to import it. So that is why India basically deals with those countries which offers it suitable deals, and that is why India is pushed to buy oil from Russia, because international oil prices are way too high. And if that is the way in which India is going to you can say purchase oil, it will be transmitted to the customers of India. And when they are going to be transmitted to the customers of India, what is going to happen? It will result in rising prices of everything. Okay, because you have seen that when the fuel prices increase, the cost of food is going to increase, the cost of transportation is going to increase, the cost of you can say energy is going to increase. Why? Because whatever you are paying is basically what is financing the imports. So that is why in order to keep a check on the prices, we need to have the import price at a controlled level, and that is exactly what India is doing. But right now, because of this, India is being accused of funding the war of Russia. Okay, the next thing which basically comes is basically the access to technology, and this was basically an aspect related to you can say sustainable development goals as well. That neither we are having the access to sufficient quantity of critical materials and minerals, and neither are these countries sharing the technology with us in order to transition towards a greener phase. Okay, so indigenous research and development takes time. Okay, collaborative work is something which can happen faster, which can be scaled up faster. So what basically it means is that unless we have technology that is accessible to us, we may not be able to scale up the technology to the level of India. And the way the research and innovation ecosystem is there within the country, it will require some more time for us to reach that particular stage on our own. Okay. Then the next theme he basically pointed out was the scourge of terrorism. Terrorism was on the backdrop of the Pahalgam attacks that happened, the brutal attacks that actually were one of the bloodiest of the confrontation, and that led to Operation Sindoor and the related military confrontation between the two countries, India and Pakistan. But at that particular notion, the External Affairs Minister of India also brought the world's attention towards terrorism and its supporters. Basically, he said that anybody who is actually supporting a country that is right now having terrorists on its soil is basically going to bear the brunt of it in the future, because it comes to bite back. Okay, so that is why he called for a deeper and more broader understanding of terrorism, so that every single country is right now in the same page, cooperating with each other, and then subsequently in this manner what we are going to see, that terrorism can be eliminated completely from the world. Okay, so this was basically the message of the External Affairs Minister for the entire United Nations General Assembly. Okay, finally he also mentioned that the United Nations as of now remains gridlocked. Now this was the highlight of this entire statement, that United Nations right now remains gridlocked for several reasons. First of all, the P5 countries, the permanent members of the Security Council, have been using the veto to serve their own interest, and that is preventing the United Nations to deliver upon the promises over which it was found. So the foundational credibility of the United Nations is right now eroding. That's the first thing. Second, because of this, there has been a constriction for the deployment of resources, for the deployment of human you can say potential, and subsequently that is something which is failing the objectives of the United Nations. Third, he basically said was the deep-rooted reluctance within the United Nations to go for a reform. And with respect to reform, he wanted a more egalitarian, representative and broad-based setup with respect to the United Nations as of now, and for that matter the United Nations Security Council, both of which we are going to discuss. Okay, so this is basically what was the External Affairs Minister's address with respect to the United Nations General Assembly. Another dramatic event that was seen during the United Nations General Assembly session was that when the Prime Minister of Israel, he went on to address the United Nations General Assembly, there was a you can say a boycott of his speech by a lot of diplomats together, and this was one of the rare occasions that actually happened on camera. Okay, so that is why this particular United Nations Assembly session this particular year has garnered so much attention. Okay, so now let us talk about, first of all, what exactly is the relevance for UPSC. Now with respect to UPSC, it is purely related to international affairs. Sometimes these questions have come with respect to the prelims examination, but majorly this particular question belongs to IR. Okay, so with respect to the IR, there is a particular you can say part of the syllabus of the UPSC which talks about the international institutions, important international institutions and fora. Fora basically is the plural of forum. Okay, their structure and mandate, and based upon this we are first of all going to understand what exactly is the United Nations system, and then subsequently we will be talking about why India is taking claim for its permanent membership at the United Nations Security Council. So eventually you will understand it, but let us understand it in a piece by piece and sequential fashion. Okay, so let us first of all start with the very beginning, and that is basically the foundation of the United Nations. So first of all, when we talk about it, we have to understand that there are certain years, okay, that have marked some of the occasions. Okay, so that will be 1919. During this particular time, two things happen. Okay, first is end of World War I. Okay, end of World War I. This was the first thing that happened, the First World War. And the second thing that happened was that it was the foundation of League of Nations. Okay, so when you talk about foundation of League of Nations, now this was the predecessor This was the predecessor for the United Nations organization. So after the end of the First World War, there were 4 countries in the world which were concerned that another such event should not take place. Okay, so these 4 countries at that particular time actually were the founding members of the League of Nations. So when we talk about this, so founding members of League of Nations, so what exactly are these countries? These countries are the United Kingdom. Okay, this was the first country. Then we had Japan, that was the second country. We had Italy, and finally we had France. Now these particular 4 countries were actually more concerned about the recurrence of any such event in the future, and that is why they came up with the idea that we should be talking about a system that is going to prevent any such world war in the future. Okay, so in 1919 this particular team of countries, they actually come together and they also receive support from other countries at that particular time. Now remember that in 1919 India was not independent. India was a proper colony of the British. So India does not have any participation as of now in this particular scenario. Okay, now with respect to the League of Nations, what happened was that this particular league was never joined by the United States. Okay, it was never joined by the United States. And subsequently what happened was that this particular league had initial success and failure. So it was more of a topsy-turvy kind of situation that it basically had. Okay, so when we talk about the League of Nations, there were 3 things that actually led to its decline. Okay, so if I have to talk about the League of Nations and decline of League of Nations, there were 3 events. Okay, now these 3 events were basically the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Okay, Japanese invasion of Manchuria was something which was actually, you can say, when the Japanese forces occupied a portion of mainland China as of now, which is called Manchuria. Okay, so Manchuria basically is in China as of now. Okay, so the Japanese invaded it, and when the countries voted for Japan to actually come out of Manchuria, Japan voted against it, and instead you can say it came out of the entire League of Nations. That was the first thing. Now the second was the second Italo-Ethiopian war. Okay, at this particular war, the monarch of Ethiopia actually urged the international community, and in particular the League of Nations, that they should be restraining or they should be condemning the way in which Italy has actually been attacking the Ethiopian monarchy or the Ethiopian kingdom. But again, the League of Nations could not act. And the third one was basically the outbreak of the Second World War. Okay, outbreak of Second World War. I am writing it as World War II like this. Okay, WW is basically World War. Okay, so after this it was effectively the end of the League of Nations, because right now you do not have any kind of such situation that you basically are trying to prevent a world war. Okay, now this particular war proved to be dramatically more disastrous, dramatically more violent, and at the same time it had a very different kind of ideological axis. Okay, so that is why what happened was that this particular World War II was something which was the final nail to the coffin of League of Nations. And subsequently, in order to come out of this, now World War II, when you talk about it, the official period is between 1939 to 45. So now what happened was that eventually even the countries right now, they understood one thing, that all the countries which are participating here either by will or by their own wish or involuntarily, like India, they were all putting in enormous amount of resources. Now these resources were basically financial, they were in terms of food, clothing, ammunition. Okay, so everything was going in. But the point is that there was seemingly no end to this particular war, and that is why it became enormously difficult to support this particular war. And this is why one of the reasons for the you can say the loss of influence of Britain from a lot of different regions was its dilapidated economic situation. Okay, so the economic situation for Britain was worsening because of this particular war. Okay, and India, despite its reluctance and its abject opposition, it was drawn into a war as a belligerent country on the side of the United Kingdom. So now when we talk about it, so there were two groups. In World War II, there are two groups. One are called Allied nations. Okay, and the other one which are there are basically called the Axis power. Okay, so when you talk about the Allied nations, here you find all the countries like USA, you will find UK, you will find France, okay, you will find Soviet Union. These are the countries on this side. On the other side of it, you are going to find Germany, you are going to find Japan, okay, these countries, you are going to find them here. Okay, the end of World War was basically the victory of Allied nations. Okay, so these countries, they were victors, and predominantly even in these two, we have these two countries which emerged as the biggest of the powers which could change the entire game. Okay, why? Because USA unleashed the power of atomic weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing, and that effectively brought Japan to its knees. Okay, and subsequently when USA was doing this, USA also recognized that Soviet Union is not far behind, and subsequently Soviet Union also started working on atomic energy and subsequently the atomic weapons. Okay, now these Allied nations together, they used to call themselves, during the war they would call themselves United Nations. Okay, so it was these Allied nations who officially were called the United Nations. Okay, why this was the case? Because at that particular time in 1941, there was a particular charter that was actually signed, and that was called the Atlantic Charter. So Atlantic Charter was basically one of the you can say agreements which visualized the end goals after the end of the Second World War. What exactly is going to be the way in which the world is going to move forward? So the Atlantic Charter was something which was conceived by the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, and the Prime Minister of United Kingdom, Winston Churchill. So these were the two individuals who actually came up with the Atlantic Charter, and they basically wanted to shape the post-war world. Okay, and that basically included the principles of self-determination for the people who are actually right now living under colonies, but predominantly it had an exception of India. British said, except for India you can be going for anything else. Okay, and then economic cooperation and peace. Subsequently, then what happens is that this particular Atlantic Charter then finds more amount of support amongst the Allied nations, and subsequently it is Franklin D. Roosevelt who actually comes up with the name United Nations for a collective name to represent the entire you can say the Allied nations. Okay, and subsequently now what happens is that when this particular thing happens, okay, now there are 5 countries. Okay, now there are 5 countries who are again going to become the founding members of this particular you can say Allied nations or the United Nations concept. Now what exactly are these 5 countries? That is where things get interesting. Okay, so when we talk about these 5 nations, so we understand that here there are so there are certain nations. Okay, the founding nations of the Allied powers. Okay, so I will be writing it Allied powers so as to allow, you can say avoid any kind of confusion. So these countries were basically USA, Soviet Union, United Kingdom. Now USA supported the inclusion of the Republic of China. Okay, so USA's support was for Republic of China. Now when we talk about Republic of China, now this basically currently is the party which is right now located to Taiwan. Okay, and UK basically batted for the position of France. Okay. So eventually now what happens, these countries are basically the ones which become the first 5 countries to found what is going to be known as the United Nations. Okay. Now in 1971, this particular Republic of China is replaced by the People's Republic of China. Okay. The People's Republic of China is the China that we know today, PRC. Okay, this happened in 1971. So till 1971, it was actually the Republic of China which was recognized as the party which is currently in Taiwan to be the you can say the member of the United Nations. People's Republic of China was not a member. Okay. Now People's Republic of China, which is the China today that we know. Okay, that particular China became a member on the insistence of India, and eventually it succeeded the Republic of China Taiwan with itself. And now China considers Taiwan as its sovereign territory. Okay. Now with the disintegration of USSR in 1991, so after 1991, USSR is no more, it is disintegrated. Okay. So then this seat is taken up by Russia. So currently these are the 5 countries which become the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Okay. So this is basically how the story of the permanent members comes to picture. Okay. Now what happens is that after this we come directly to the 1945 year, and here we have a particular conference that is called the San Francisco Conference. Okay. So the San Francisco Conference was basically the conference which was actually the conference of United Nations International Cooperation, where India was also invited as a separate country, and this basically was the one which actually gave birth to the United Nations organization. Okay. So India was one of the nations which basically was here to sign this particular convention, and subsequently there were 50 nations that actually came together to draw the United Nations Charter. Basically this is the charter that we actually have with respect to the way in which the United Nations functions. So this is from which the United Nations actually derives its existence and its powers. Okay. So after this we see the formation of the United Nations, and that basically happens in October 1945. Okay. So in October 1945, after the ratification by these nations, we basically have the United Nations organization coming into picture with 6 main bodies. Okay. So that is what we are going to discuss now. Okay. So before we go there, let us also understand what exactly are the objectives of the United Nations Charter, which is largely based upon the lines of the you can say the charter that was getting formulated by the allied powers before the World War II. Okay. So the first thing that they realized was that it is important that it is never going to be the case that a world war gets repeated. So there needs to be lasting peace, and that is why to ensure peace throughout the world, that's the first thing. Second thing, there needs to be some neutral ground where the countries can come together without hesitation and engage with each other in friendly relations. Now that was the second thing, to develop the friendly relations among these nations. Now they wanted to shift the priority from colonization to decolonization, and from decolonization towards the human development aspect. Okay, because now what happens is that after 1945 we see emergence of a large number of nations which were formerly colonies of a lot of different of these powers. Just like when you talk about India, India got its independence in 1947. Along with India we have Pakistan. Okay, after that we have Sri Lanka, then we have China, then subsequently we have a lot more nations from the African continent which actually gained their independence back to back. And subsequently in this particular regard we see that the colonies have only left these particular, the colonialists have left these colonies exploited, and they need to develop on their own. Second thing, the you can say post-war Europe was something which was completely decimated. So that is why there was a dedicated need to now stop the fighting and subsequently focus towards rebuilding efforts, because that is what was going to be good for business, because these were the countries which were actually financing the war, and at the same time they had the technology to rebuild themselves. But now their business is going to expand when their you can say their entire cycle is now going to be focused upon the reconstruction efforts as well. So that is why the next one was the ways to improve life and how nations can coordinate together in order to ensure that they are now focusing on improving the living standards and ensuring that we are fighting hunger. Okay, subsequently we are fighting poverty, and then so many different things, rights and freedoms and all things came up. Okay, and then subsequently there needs to be a central body for coordinating the entire global effort. So that is something which will be done by the United Nations as a multilateral forum. What exactly is the meaning of multilateral? Multilateral basically means that it has got multiple participants who are going to take upon the decisions. It is not going to be the decision of one country, one person, or for that matter one organization. Okay, so this brings me to another concept, that when you talk about United Nations, so United Nations is not a sovereign body on itself. Okay, United Nation is not a sovereign body in itself. Remember this. Okay. Why? Because in the coming slides you are going to also explore why exactly Palestine has not yet been accepted as one of the members by the United Nations. Okay. Now, going towards the next part, we are going to talk about the parts of the United Nations, the main bodies. So when you talk about the main bodies, there are two things. There are main bodies of UN, which are also called the principal bodies. Okay, and the second thing that we basically have with respect to this particular part is the presence of a United Nations system. Okay, so UN system. What exactly is the difference? The first thing that we have to understand, the main bodies of United States basically come into existence. They come into existence by the United Nations Charter. Okay, so they come into existence by the United Nations Charter. So these were actually you can say mentioned in under the United Nations Charter that these bodies are going to be established. Okay, now UN system are basically the bodies which have signed permanent agreement, with the United Nations. Okay, and subsequently they basically work in coordination with the United Nations. Okay, so that is basically what happens here. Now, when you talk about these main bodies, this is where we focus, because there are over 30 such bodies in the United Nations systems, and we cannot be considering or covering all of them together. So these 6 bodies, which basically are called the principal bodies, are the United Nations General Assembly. Okay, then we have the Security Council, the United Nations Security Council. Then we have the Economic and Social Council. Then we have the Trusteeship Council. Then we have the International Court of Justice. I will be writing ICJ. Okay, and the last one is United Nations Secretariat. So these are basically the bodies that actually come into the existence based upon the UN Charter. Just like we have constitutional bodies in India, that there are certain bodies which have been mentioned in the Constitution of India, and that is why their existence is mandatory. Case in point, Election Commission of India, Comptroller Auditor General, UPSC for that matter, all of these are constitutional bodies and they have been mentioned in the Constitution of India. Similarly, these bodies have been mentioned in the Charter of the United Nations itself. Okay, so that's the first thing that we need to understand. Okay, now we are going to discuss these principal bodies in a little bit of detail. Okay, so the first one that we start with is basically the General Assembly. Okay, so this is basically the hall of the General Assembly in the headquarters, that is in New York. Okay, so I will also be telling you the headquarters. So with respect to ICJ, International Court of Justice, all the others, okay, when you talk about General Assembly, Security Council, Economic and Social Council, Trusteeship Council and United Nations Secretariat, they all have their headquarters in New York. Okay, this is their headquarter. But with respect to the International Court of Justice, it is basically in The Hague, Netherlands. That is where this particular organization has its seats. Okay, the Palace of Peace. So this is the only principal body to have its headquarters beyond New York. Rest all of them have their offices, their headquarters in New York, and United Nations itself is housed in the New York. With respect to UN system, you have many such you can say organizations like World Health Organization, Food and Agricultural Organization, United Nations Children Emergency Fund, which is now called United Nations Children's Fund, okay, UNESCO. These are basically all the bodies which come here, and they have their headquarters located throughout the you can say the entire world. Okay, some of them are in Europe, predominantly in Geneva. Okay, some of them basically are in Africa. So that is basically how we have these bodies coming up. Okay, so this is basically the General Assembly Hall of the United Nations General Assembly. Okay, so this is where all the delegates of the countries they sit together, and this is where the speaker is there to address the entire assembly. Okay, so this is basically what happens. So right now on the screen, the individual who you are actually seeing is basically the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. Okay, he basically is addressing the entire General Assembly. Now what exactly is the objective of this General Assembly? Okay, so we are going to discuss the functions of General Assembly. So General Assembly is written as United Nations General Assembly, has its short form as UNGA. Okay, so the first function, okay, it is the primary deliberative body. Okay, primary deliberative body. What exactly is it going to deliberate or discuss upon? This is basically going to discuss upon the matters of global importance. Okay, like international security. Okay, then we have basically the problem of climate change or sustainable development. Okay, then at the same time we talk about any kind of humanitarian crisis. They are all going to be a part of this particular you can say thing. Okay, so they are going to be deliberating upon that. They are also going to approve the budget. Okay, so they are the primary deliberative body where you can put forth your views, and at the same time you also have a right to respond against someone else. Okay, so you can do that here. That's the first function that we have as the United Nations General Assembly. The second function that we have basically is with respect to the admission of new members. Okay, admission of new members. We are going to discuss this as well in detail towards the end, how exactly the members get admitted to the United Nations. Okay, the next thing that they basically do is the appointment of the United Nations Secretary General, appointment of Secretary General, who technically is the administrative head of the United Nations Secretariat. Okay, that's the first thing. And then at the same time, appointment of judges to International Court of Justice. So when you talk about the judges who are appointed to the International Court of Justice, they serve a term of 9 years. Okay, so I'll write that term as well. What exactly is the term? So Secretary General has a term of 5 years, and the judges at ICJ, they have a term of 9 years. Okay, so this is basically how you see that the functions of the United Nations General Assembly are. Okay, so anything which basically is issued here is issued in the form of something which you are very familiar as resolutions. So it passes resolutions on various matters. Okay, but there is a very important aspect of this. These resolutions are non-binding. Okay, they are non-binding. It basically means that even if the countries which are members of this particular organization, these countries may not follow the resolution that has just been accepted. Okay, if a country is violating this particular resolution, they will not be having any kind of repercussions that they have to face. Okay, Further, United Nations General Assembly basically is the most representative body of the United Nations. Okay, it is the most representative body. Why? Because here we basically have 193 members. All the countries which are basically members of the United Nations, which are currently 193, so they are all members of the United Nations General Assembly. Okay, and every member has one vote. So there is no kind of difference with respect to the vote value of any country, with respect to their financial status, with respect to their territorial size, with respect to their contribution to the United Nations, doesn't matter. All the countries have got one vote. Okay. Apart from that, the United Nations General Assembly is also the body which will elect the non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Okay, so that we'll be discussing there. Okay. So this is something which is basically the concept of the United Nations Security Council. Now, when the decisions are to be made, when the resolutions are to be accepted or they are to be made, what exactly is the criteria? How exactly are these decisions made? So there are two types of questions in which they are categorized. One, questions are matters of urgent and international importance. The second one are ordinary questions. So in the international importance type of questions, we basically have got the aspects of international peace and security, admission of new members, and budgetary matters. Okay, in these matters, the amount or the minimum number of votes that must be secured in support of a particular resolution is basically 2/3 of the majority. Okay, so out of the 193 members, first of all, the members who are actually voting right now, let us say that out of 193 members, 180 are voting. Okay, 180 are present and voting. So now we will have to consider 2/3 of this particular vote. Okay, so 2/3 of 180, so that will basically be 120. 3 times of 60 is 180, 60 times of 2 is 120. So if a particular resolution has a support of at least 120 countries, because of the 180 countries which are present and voting, it will be adopted or passed by the United Nations General Assembly. No less than that. Now when you talk about simple majority, it will just be one more than the 50% of the members present and voting. Okay, so that is basically the simple majority concept. Okay, none of these resolutions except for the budgetary matters are binding. Okay, so no other resolutions are binding on any of these. Okay, now in order to draft the various resolutions that are to be considered by the United Nations General Assembly, there are 6 different committees which handle 6 different divisions with respect to the matters that are to be presented. So the first committee is on is called the Committee of Disarmament and International Security. So it is basically going to come up with those matters which are related to either disarmament. So disarmament basically means complete ban on the usage of some kinds of weapons. Now these weapons are basically those weapons which cause widespread destruction, and at the same time they will have long-term implications, just like use of nuclear weapons, use of chemical weapons, biological weapons. So in order for us to ensure that nobody in the world is either developing it, stockpiling it, accessing it, we have to ensure disarmament. So that is basically one of the foundational goals of the you can say of the values of India and Indian foreign policy as well, because when we started contributing, one of our first aspect was to contribute to global peace. Okay, because we basically believe in the philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So that is basically where it comes from. Okay, now the second committee is on economic and financial matters. The third one on social, humanitarian and cultural matters. Fourth one is on special political and decolonization. Fifth one is on additional and administrative and budgetary matters. The last one is on legal matters. Okay, so these are basically the committees which draft the resolutions based upon which the consideration will be taken up by the United Nations General Assembly. Okay, now before we move ahead, let me also tell you what exactly is the process of a particular country joining the United Nations. Okay, so how does a country become a member of United Nations? how does a country become a member? So first of all, we have to understand that when we talk about the membership, so membership is open to all. Membership is open to all. But there is only one condition. Okay. All those countries which are willing to abide by or uphold the United Nations Charter. So you have to strictly abide by and uphold the United Nations Charter. That is the first rule that you are going to have. The second thing what you are going to do is that you are going to, the country seeking membership forwards the application to the United Nations or makes an application to the Secretary General. Okay. The third thing, after this application has been received, okay, then it is sent for scrutiny of United Nations Security Council. Then after that, the UNSC forwards it to the United Nations General Assembly for its consideration. Okay. So, if the application receives, again the same decision making procedure, if the application receives more than 2/3 of votes of members present and voting, so basically what happens, you become a member of United Nations. Okay, this basically takes you towards your United Nations membership. Okay, so this is basically how we see the membership procedure for any particular country. So this is to be initiated by the country itself. Nobody else can sponsor it for you. You have to initiate it on your own. Okay, then your scrutiny will take place, and subsequently then what is going to happen is that the United Nations General Assembly is going to vote upon it. Now this is basically the second and the most important body of the United Nations United Nations system, and that is the United Nations Security Council. Okay, so when you talk about this particular council, this council is the one which has been given the mandate to ensure international security, okay, international peace. That is basically why this particular council has been given the power to impose binding restrictions, okay, or binding orders on the member countries. So all the countries which basically are members of the United Nations, they are bound by the orders that are given by the United Nations Security Council. So this is the only body of the United Nations which can issue such sanctions or such orders. Okay, so this is basically the United Nations Security Council sitting up. If I have to tell you, this particular image is actually from 2021-2022, and this particular, if you can see this highlight, okay, this is basically the representative from the side of India, when India basically was a part of the 15-member United Nations Security Council. Okay, so this is basically India, the representative from India. Okay, now when we talk about the United Nations Security Council, so as I have already told you, only body to issue binding resolutions or binding orders. Okay, now with respect to the binding orders, what we have understood, that these particular orders are required because this body has been mandated to ensure international peace and security. Okay, so international peace and security and its maintenance is basically the work of the United Nations Security Council. The third thing that basically happens, which comes from this entire principle, is that when you have to ensure international peace and security, you will also be evaluating the threats. Evaluating the threats to international peace and security. Okay, that's the next thing. We have to understand this. Then once you have evaluated the threats, then what you are going to do? Now you basically are going to understand who are the parties involved. And once the parties involved are basically identified, what you are going to do? You are going to go for calling out the parties involved for peaceful resolution of the dispute. Okay, so with respect to peaceful resolution of dispute, there are certain mechanisms, okay, that are mentioned in the United Nations Charter. So these mechanisms are basically dialogue, arbitration and compromise. Okay, these are basically the ones which are mentioned in the United Nations Charter. So these are going to be the first steps that are to be taken by the United Nations Security Council. Okay, the next thing, once you basically are doing this, what exactly are you going to do the next thing? If this does not work, okay, if reconciliation fails, it can impose sanctions. Okay, now is the important part, that it can impose sanctions, authorize use of force, okay, and the third one that we basically have is deployment of peacekeeping forces. This is basically what we have with respect to the United Nations Security Council. So this is the primary mandate and this is how they function. Okay, this is how they function. So first would be peaceful resolution. If the countries agree or if the parties agree, they will be called upon. They are going to negotiate, they are going to alleviate their fears and suspicions, and subsequently the world will go back to its normal order. If not, then what is going to happen? There will be binding orders that will be issued. We'll be discussing what exactly are the sanctions, but this is exactly how you are going to talk about it. Okay. Now, coming to the more contentious part of the United Nations Security Council, we basically talk about the composition of the United Nations Security Council. Okay. So when you talk about the composition of the United Nations Security Council, they are basically made out of two different kinds of members: 5 permanent members, 10 non-permanent members. Okay. Now basically what is the issue here is that these 10 non-permanent members, they are elected by the United Nations General Assembly for a 2-year term. Okay, so they are elected for a 2-year term. Now these 5 members are the ones who are the permanent members of this particular council, and they basically have a very important thing, that is the veto power. And with respect to the veto power, this is absolute veto. This is absolute veto. Okay. Now what exactly is the situation is that with respect to the composition of the United Nations Security Council, the composition was given in 1946. Okay, it is the same as that was given in the original you can say foundation, as that was given in 1946. So in 1946, what happened was that at that particular time, the number of member states of the United Nations was 51. Today, the number of members of the United Nations is 193, and still we have the same, you can say, composition of the United Nations Security Council, further having veto to these 5 permanent members. Okay, so who are these 5 permanent members? I hope you have understood who are these 5 members. So these 5 permanent members, also called P5. Okay, they are also called as P5 together. Okay, they are basically USA, UK, Russia, China, France. Okay, and each of them have got veto, and that veto is absolute veto. Basically, it means that any particular resolution that is being considered by the United Nations Security Council, if any of these members disagree, at that particular time, what is going to happen? The resolution is going to die right there. It is going to end right there. And this also includes the scrutiny of the United Nations Security Council. Okay. So in the with respect to the admission of the members to the United Nations General Assembly, when we talk about the scrutiny by the United Nations Security Council, here you basically need to secure votes of all permanent members. Okay, so basically it means that none of the permanent members should actually veto your candidature. Okay, then at the same time secure 9 out of 15 votes in favor. And when this is done, then what happens is that this particular application is then going to see its next stage. If any of the permanent member vetoes this particular proposal, even the candidature dies down. Okay, so be it the candidature, be it any kind of resolution, that is supposed to be completely abstained. That is going to stop right there with the use of veto. But what does this veto does not contain? This veto cannot prevent a debate. It can only prevent a decision or a resolution. It cannot prevent a debate. So you can still debate. Okay, you can still debate, but you will not be able to pass a resolution, and that is basically where we have the primary root cause why India is also wanting to be a part of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Why? Because all these countries, they basically have used this particular veto power to serve their own interest. Okay, if we have to check, the maximum number of vetoes have been used by USA, Russia and China. Okay, the absolute maximum is Russia. Okay, and then subsequently it is followed by USA. Okay, so USA, since the foundation 1946, it has used it for 93 times. Okay, with respect to Russia 139 times, and with respect to China 21 times. Okay, UK and France have not used their veto since you can say 1989, and they still advocate that we should not be using veto in order to serve our own interest. Okay, but these resolutions that have been vetoed by these countries, now they are the ones which need to be reintroduced again, and subsequently if then they are going to be passed, then you basically have this particular scenario of any kind of order by the United Nations Security Council. So I hope this is something that is clear, and this is basically the root cause. Right now, what the External Affairs Minister also said there was that the inability of the United Nations Security Council to intervene directly either at the Russia-Ukraine conflict or the Israel-Hamas conflict right now is because of this. Okay, and that is what most of the countries also agree to, and that is what makes India's case for permanent candidature to the United Nations Security Council solid. Okay, so that is basically the scenario here. I hope this is something which is clear. Okay, now going to the next one, the Economic and Social Council. It is in short called the ECOSOC. Okay, so Economic and Social Council is basically the council that actually is responsible for the developmental goals and the agenda of the United Nations. Okay, so it basically is the coordinating body for developmental agenda, economic, social and governmental issues. Okay, and what exactly is the policy formulation that is required, what exactly is the deliberation that is required, the review of the progress, that is actually done by the Economic and Social Council. Okay, Then at the same time, it also is the one which is the implementing body of all the internationally agreed developmental goals, just like the Sustainable Development Goals for Agenda 2030. Okay. So basically there are 54 members which actually are elected for a 3-year term to the Economic and Social Council by the United Nations General Assembly. So here you basically have the membership open to all the full members of the United Nations. Okay. So that is basically ECOSOC. Then we have the Trusteeship Council. Now this empty hall that you are basically seeing is in itself a symbol that Trusteeship Council right now is defunct. Okay, so I'll write it here. It is defunct, or it is not functioning since 1994. So what basically happened was that it was established in 1945. Okay, it was also established in 1945, but there was a very important consideration. After the First World War, there were certain territories which were actually taken back, or they were restored from the you can say the countries which were actually defeated, like Germany. Okay, the fall of the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. So what basically happened was that these countries or these regions were then divided amongst the various countries as mandates. Okay, they were basically divided as mandates. Now they were basically given the responsibility to administer these areas. Okay, so one such mandate was actually the mandate of Palestine. So Palestine formerly was a part of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so after the fall of the Ottoman Empire with the end of the First World War, the mandate of Palestine actually fell with the British. Okay, now when British were basically given this particular mandate of Palestine, now it was under this particular mandate that they gave a particular declaration called the Balfour Declaration. Okay, now Balfour Declaration was basically a declaration which promised that the state of Palestine or the mandate of Palestine would be utilized for settling the Jews in this particular region, also at the same time protecting the rights of the minorities which are actually living here. So basically that is the Palestinian Arabs. Now the point with Palestine at that particular time is that it is populated with Arabs. Okay, so Palestine is populated with Arabs who are Muslims. Okay, now when you talk about the Balfour Declaration, it wants to settle in Jews in this particular land. Why? Because right now this mandate is with the British, and subsequently because of this particular declaration, gradually we see waves of Jewish migration actually coming and settling into the region which was erstwhile populated by the Palestinian Arabs. And then subsequently what happens, gradually we see that there is a change in the you can say the demography of this particular region, and that is the start point of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Okay, so such regions basically were the ones which were handed back to the United Nations in 1945. So at that particular time, the British as well as the French forces said that we do not have the resources to administer these countries or these territories, so kindly take them back and you run the governments here. So technically the Trusteeship Council was actually established in order to ensure how exactly these territories are going to transition into democracies. Okay, so that is why it is called trusteeship, that this is basically going to be governed in absence of a government which is going to be elected or formed by the people of these colonies. Okay, so this Trusteeship Council went defunct in 1994 when the last of the territories, okay, it actually selected its own government, how exactly it wanted to rule. And since then, this empty hall is something that actually is the memoir of the Trusteeship Council. Okay, so that is all that we have with respect to the Trusteeship Council. Now, talking about the recognition of Palestine. So I have told in the beginning that Palestine has been recognized in this particular United Nations General Assembly session by France, and at the same time just a day before the beginning of this by Britain, Australia, Canada and countries like those. So basically what does this particular thing mean? Okay, so it means that these countries understand that Palestine as of now is an independent territory. Okay, so recognition basically means acceptance of an independent territory of Palestine. I hope this is clear. Then the next thing that we have is basically that this particular independent territory of Palestine will have the power of governing the territory, okay, conducting economic activities beneficial to its interest, and at the same time what it will also do is basically that it will be becoming a part of the United Nations. So we recognize this. So a lot of countries, when you talk about the recognition of Palestine, this basically also means that they also accept the establishment of diplomatic relations. Okay, so what happens is that when two countries actually engage with each other on friendly terms, so you basically exchange envoys. Okay, envoys basically means ambassadors. Okay, so they basically are going to be serving in that particular country, representing the other country. Just like when we talk about India, so India sends its ambassadors to most of the friendly countries in the world. Just like you talk about USA, you talk about United Kingdom, you talk about even Palestine. Okay, we have our own envoys there, we have it in even Afghanistan. Okay, so technically what is their job? Their job is to first of all be there and at the same time ensure that these countries are not doing something which is hampering India's interest. Second, clearly convey India's priorities and the way India wants to engage with them. So build up a constructive dialogue with these countries so that we can be engaging with them on the front of trade, on the front of energy, and on the front of you can say development. Then at the same time, if there is any part of the Indian population or the Indian diaspora which is present there, it is the job of these emissaries or ambassadors to take care of these Indian citizens. Okay, so that is why all those countries which basically are recognizing Palestine, they are also in a way favoring to have a diplomatic relation with this particular country. Okay, so how many countries? Over 150 countries. Over 150 countries which are also members of United Nations recognize Palestine. So over 75%, over 75% of the you can say the membership of the United Nations basically recognizes Palestine as a separate country. Now what exactly is the issue? There are problems as well. Okay, now this particular recognition as of now is symbolic. Okay, this is symbolic, means it does not entail any significant change. It is only the support for this particular territory that has just showed up, nothing else. Okay, why is it symbolic? Because there is no agreed international boundary of Palestine. Okay, no agreed international boundaries of Palestine. That's the first thing. Okay, the next thing that we basically have with respect to this is that there is no recognized capital. No recognized capital. That is the second thing that we have. Okay, no capital city that we have with respect to Palestine as of now. Palestine does say that Ramallah is my capital, but that is not recognized internationally. The third one that we basically have with respect to this is that there is no standing army. Okay, so that is why this particular recognition even now is symbolic. Now first thing is the most important part, that Palestine as of now does not have any internationally agreed and recognized Palestinian boundaries. Why? Because unless you have boundaries, what exactly is your territory? And unless you have the territory, what exactly is your claim for a territory? How exactly are you going to be a sovereign government of that particular territory? So that's the first case. Okay, the second case, the lack of a capital city which has international recognition. This is going to be the second step after you have an internationally agreed and recognized territory. The third thing is basically, in order to defend yourself, you must also be having a standing army or a military. That is something which right now is not there. Hamas is not a military unit of Palestine. Okay, so that is basically Why? The Palestinian issue right now is something which is still symbolic. Okay, and it is only in the context of Palestine, okay, Israel and Palestine, do we have this particular term that is called the two-state solution. Okay, this was basically a previous year question for UPSC as well. So when we talk about the two-state solution, so two-state solution basically means that there will be two different nations coexisting together on the land which was formerly called Palestine. So in this two-state solution, basically there will be the part of East Jerusalem. Okay, you may not be understanding it now, that is fine, I am just telling you the territories. Okay, West Bank, and there is something which is called the Gaza Strip. Okay, these three territories will basically be the part of Palestine, and rest everything which is there on this particular land will be the part of Israel. Okay, that is basically the way in which a solution was proposed for Israel and Palestine. Now, this particular map is something that you are going to see in your handout. So do check the handout of this. You are going to find a map there where I have shown this two-state solution which was proposed in 1947 by the United Nations. Because in 1947 the situation went so drastically violent that it was proposed that there should be a partition of that particular land into two countries, and that is where the word two-state solution comes into picture. Okay, I hope this is something which is clear with respect to Palestine. Excuse me. Now, we have discussed this, how does a country become a member of the United Nations, so you may want to revise it. Now, why exactly India seeks reforms at the United Nations? Okay, so the first thing that we have already seen, okay, so that is basically the misuse of, or for that matter overuse of veto. Okay, this is something which paralyzes the entire working of the United Nations Security Council, preventing it to take decisive action. That's the first thing that India is not very happy about. Second thing is basically the growing influence of India. Okay, so when we talk about growing influence of India, we talk about military influence, that India has demonstrated itself as a responsible nuclear power. India basically developed its nuclear power program on its own. There was no country which helped India, and India faced tough sanctions for it. Okay, so we basically talk about military. We have military might and influence. Okay, the second thing, economy of India, which is expanding, and it is one of the largest economies in the world. Okay, and the third thing, the legacy of India, legacy of civilization, that India has always stood for peace. That is predominantly the foundational value of the Indian foreign policy as well. Okay, so that is basically the growing influence of India. Now the third thing, apart from that, when we talk about it, we are one of the largest contributors, one of the largest contributors to the peacekeeping missions. Peacekeeping operations. Okay, so we are one of the largest contributors to this. Presently, we are the fourth largest in terms of troops. Okay, in terms of troops or soldiers. Indians have led a lot of peacekeeping operations, okay, for the United Nations Security Council in the United Nations peacekeeping forces. So that is why India actually stakes claim. Okay, the fourth thing, India is basically a voice for the developing world. India basically sees itself as the leader of the developing world, and also at the same time the developing world also in various ways resonates this particular feeling. So that is why we want to have a more inclusive and egalitarian kind of you can say system at the United Nations, and that is basically the main plank of India here. Okay, so these are basically the various ways in which India actually wants to reinforce its position as a very strong candidate for the United Nations. Okay, and for this there is a particular group of 4 countries which are called G4. So these are basically 4 countries of the world which actually support each other's candidature as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Okay, and this is predominantly aimed at the United Nations Security Council. Okay, so these 4 nations are India, Japan, Brazil, and at the same time we have Germany. So these are the 4 countries which have vowed that we are going to support each other's candidature, and at the same time we are also going to push for reforms at the United Nations Security Council. So on behalf of G4, okay, there was a G4 proposal presented by India for reforms of United Nations Security Council. Okay, now this was something which was presented by India in 2024. So it was basically a model. Okay, so I will just be discussing this particular model with you. So when you talk about this particular proposal, what did they suggest? They suggested that there should be expansion in the composition of United Nations Security Council. This was their primary model that they wanted to go for. Okay, and that basically said that there should be 11 permanent members, and at the same time there should be 15 or 16 non-permanent members. So technically they wanted to say that United Nations Security Council should have 25 or 26 countries. Okay, at the same time these 11 permanent members will include all the countries of the G4. Okay, that was their model. And at the same time veto could be sparingly used. It cannot be used at your own whims and policies. It can be used in a limited fashion, in a controlled manner. So this is basically what was the proposal that came up, but as the case stands that it did not go through with respect to the United Nations Security Council as of now, but India, at the same time these countries are still trying very hard to get this particular proposal passed. Okay. So I hope you have understood what exactly is the United Nations Security Council and its entire system. Okay, that the principal bodies, what exactly are their mandates, and subsequently what exactly is the situation right now with respect to Palestine, and how exactly India wants to get into the reforms of the United Nations Security Council predominantly. Okay, so with respect to this, I hope this is something which is clear, and if there are any doubts, please let me know, and do comment if you have any kind of doubts as well, and subsequently we can be taking up those doubts. Okay, so this will all that will be required for you to write a wonderful answer of 150 to 200, maybe 250 words depending upon the various aspects that come. Okay, and subsequently all your mandates are covered. So hoping that these things have got some kind of understanding within your brain, and at the same time I promise you I'll be coming up with a very detailed discussion on what exactly is the Israel-Palestinian situation, and subsequently why exactly has that not yet been solved. Okay, so I'll be doing a detailed video on that. In that you will be understanding these things very clearly. As of now, refer to the map that is there in the handout. Okay, that will help you understand the territories that I mentioned. Okay, so see you next time. Thank you so much. All the very best.